Okay. Hello everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of Much Ado About the AQ. This will be strange for you if you're watching on YouTube because you won't have seen us actually talking with our faces and everything because we've only been on Spotify and so on previously. I'm Joe Payne. I am expert to the layman, layman to the expert on the AQ. I'm probably the least capable person on this entire call, so I'll mostly be being quiet and listening to significantly more qualified people than myself speaking. I'm joined as ever by my colleague and friend, Dr. Taylor, who is that way. Introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me again on our podcast.
That you co-present. And we're delighted to be joined today, our first guest on the podcast, the fantastic and highly esteemed Elizabeth Winkler. Dr. Taylor, you had an introduction of sorts prepared, I believe.
Yes, I do. Well, first of all, Elizabeth, thank you very much for joining us and giving of your time
Mm.
on this long distance call. And congratulations on your book, Shakespeare and Other Heresies. Um, I wanted to share with you, just as a kind of an opener, a review you probably heard. And this is by a chap called Andre Aciman or Ackerman. I can't really make out the name, but he describes your book as an extraordinarily brilliant and scholarly work, written with an unyielding, sleuthing instinct and sparkling with, he says, pleasurably naughty moments. This page turner is mesmerizing. Um, and that's the vibe, if you like, that I got from your book, because I think I picked up on it from the De Vere Society, and I pre-ordered it. I didn't know you as a journalist. I didn't have any preconceptions other than I knew it would be on the AQ. But congratulations on the book. We bought
Mm.
several copies from the school library, and it's doing the rounds. Joe's in the middle of it. I've finished it long since.
Yep.
Um, and I just wanted to pick up on the fact that the subtitle of the book is how doubting the bard became the biggest taboo in literature,
Hmm.
and the fact that you've got words there that have obvious religious connotations. Heresy, which is Greek for doubt, choice, sorry, doubt and taboo. So my opening question, which is kind of a deep dive question, I suppose, as an opener, is why is it, do you think, that so many people approach the AQ with this almost religious passion?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, thank you for having me on here. And I love the quote that you read. It's from Andre Aciman, who's he's a novelist known for most famous for his book Call Me by Your Name, which was adapted to a film with Timothy Chalamet a few years ago.
Mm.
He's also a professor of comparative literature in New York. But yes, I did love that he said it's sparkling with naughty moments, and this book is all about being a little bit naughty when it comes to Shakespeare. Um, Heresy, religious quality of the whole topic. Yes, it's because over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries, Shakespeare was enshrined as essentially an English Christ figure. That's part of the history that I trace in the book. I wanted to understand for myself why this subject is so absurdly um, emotional for people, why people get so furious about it, and they react when you raise questions about the authorship of 400-year-old plays. They react a little bit like the way Victorians in the 19th century reacted if you questioned the divinity of Christ. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same kind of highly irrational reaction. And to me as a journalist, that was most what was most interesting about this whole subject. Of course, it's fun to try to figure out, the detective story of who might have written the works, and the book does do that, going through the different theories. But really, the thrust is in that subtitle: how this became so taboo, and what began to happen. I mean, I think you have to understand the whole history really of religious turmoil in Britain, from the Reformation, the divisions between Catholic and Protestant camps. Then of course you have civil war in Britain in the 17th century, and and Shakespeare emerged after that as a kind of unifying national icon who could bring these disparate groups together under one sort of figure. And in the 18th century, you start to see people making pilgrimages to Stratford upon Avon, which becomes a kind of English Bethlehem. They throw themselves down at the birthplace, which is, the purported site of his nativity. There's no evidence that he was actually born there, but it becomes this kind of spiritual place of worship. People cut relics from the local trees, like the pieces of the true cross. They sing odes to divine Shakespeare. There's really a kind of veneration that begins to take place. And the playwright George Bernard Shaw referred to it as bardolatry. Now, Shakespeare scholars know this. This is well documented. Nothing about that is controversial. But that's what began to happen. At the end of the 18th century, there's an amazing painting that was done by the artist George Romney of baby Shakespeare, the infant Shakespeare, in what is essentially a nativity scene as a Christ child. It's so extraordinary. It's now in the Folger Shakespeare Library here in Washington, D.C. I put the picture in my book just because I thought it encapsulated things so well. And people are kind of astonished when they see that. But this is really what happened. And of course, this is also the age of British imperialism. The 18th and 19th centuries, extraordinary, growth, colonization, and Britain sort of becomes, Shakespeare becomes held up as proof of Britain's cultural superiority and of its right to rule. Look, we have Shakespeare. You should be so lucky to be ruled by us. So those twin elements, the kind of the religious fervor and then the nationalism, imperial element, become kind of intertwined over the 18th and 19th centuries, to the point where Shakespeare becomes truly, the father god of Britain, but also really of one of the father gods of Western culture. And, you find him revered by the Germans, and, even the French sort of they hate to admit it, the French don't like this, but they sort of admit the greatness of Shakespeare, so he spreads, of course, globally, India and China in part through the British Empire. And so it's the religious veneration of Shakespeare in the first place that then makes questioning the authorship so scandalous, even though, of course, no one is questioning the greatness of the works. And this is what's so funny. There's a conflation that happens between the plays and the person, because people say, I love Shakespeare. What they mean, of course, is I love the plays. And we all know that's what they mean. But then if you say, oh, it might have been someone else, they suddenly get really upset, as though you're taking away the works. Now, this isn't rational, of course. Of course, this isn't rational, but it's an emotional response to this whole phenomenon, because Shakespeare just looms so large in British culture and in Western culture.
Yeah, completely agree. It's interesting. There's a similar veneration to almost the founding fathers in America.
Yes.
In many ways, it's this symbol of a nation almost.
Absolutely. You see something similar with when people began suggesting that Thomas Jefferson, the father of the Declaration of Independence, may have fathered children by his slave, Sally Hemings, not something we want to think about one of the founding fathers. Historians rejected that. It was just that was too much, a step too far. Then DNA evidence proved that he did. And now at Monticello, which is Jefferson's home in Virginia, there's a whole exhibit on his relationship with Sally Hemings. So it's an interesting example of how these paradigm shifts happen. It's something, a theory is heretical, it's resisted by the sort of the establishment for a long time, and then a shift happens, and now they say, okay, fine, maybe it's true.
And the final phase is acceptance, isn't it? Typically, it's a blend of the grieving process, or as you say, the heresy that slowly takes root. It's resisted, it's fought against, and then it's accepted. But the alternative candidate theory for Shakespeare's plays seems not to be accepted. I mean, some people won't even approach it. So we don't discuss it in British state schools, US high schools. It's very hard to talk about it at university level. So yeah, there is a religious component and a deeply interesting psychological component to the acceptance of an alternative theory and the rejection of it, I find.
Yeah, it is interesting. I've encountered people who say, oh, actually a teacher mentioned that. Or actually I had a course, at university. There are universities here and there that actually offer authorship seminars. I spoke to a professor at York University in Canada, a theater professor, who did a course on the subject, and his colleagues in English sort of scoffed and said, oh, no one's going to sign up for that. And then the students loved it, and there was a waiting list every year. So you actually do find these pockets of schools and universities that teach it, or even just sometimes a professor will just mention it offhand and people remember it, and that it sort of sticks with them because it's such a remarkable, bizarre idea. But yes, the psychological dynamics are interesting, and it has to do with our emotional attachment to the traditional story of Shakespeare, I think. It's a wonderful, beautiful rags to riches story, isn't it? Of this boy who sort of comes from nothing. His family appears to be illiterate, very humble origins, minimal, if any, education, and becomes the greatest writer in the English language. Great story, fantastic story, a kind of Cinderella story. It's that rags to riches tale is one of the sort of the foundational cultural narratives that we like to tell. And you can find it in religious tales, in fairy tales, in the narratives of charismatic politicians who sort of come from nothing and then, ascend to power. And the political scientist George Lakoff calls it one of our deep narratives, sort of embedded in our culture. And it's a story we like to repeat and repeat because it's an affirming story, it's an inspiring story, but our emotional attachment to that narrative makes it difficult to examine critically. People like the story that they've heard, and if you try and take it away and tell them actually it might not be the right story, they get really sort of defensive of it. Hilary Mantel, she did a great series of lectures for the BBC on history and the sort of rewriting, rethinking history. And she said, people are attached to the first version of history that they learn, and if you try to take it away, it's as though you're taking away their childhoods. It's the story they learned as children. Maybe their parents took them to see plays, or a teacher taught them this story, and they feel this like they don't want you to change it for them, and they sort of feel like you're really you're taking away something really important to them if you correct the narrative.
Yeah, it's a foundational narrative, isn't it? Very often as well, the Stratfordian community, for it is they very often accuse people who denigrate Shakespeare and who attack the theory of the Stratford man as class-based. It's a snobbish maneuver. You're accused of being a snob. But obviously, one of the alternative candidates is Marlowe, whose father was a cobbler and who was literally a rags to riches boy. Came from, very meager domestic beginnings, went to the King's School, probably the oldest school in the world, went to Cambridge and totally reinvented himself. So I always try, because luckily at the Langton where we teach, I actually run an AQ module. So we're one of the heretic, fringe. And I always try and accentuate the fact that we're not snobs. That's not the objection we're making. It's more to do with the lack of sound historical evidence in favour of the Stratford man.
Part of the reason this podcast exists is because we are two working class men who are trying to avoid being seen as in some way classist. Neither of us come from an upper class kind of household. My dad was a builder, and my mum never really worked in her life, and so we're trying to combat that by saying no, it's not class. We don't believe that just because he grew up as the son of a merchant potentially that he couldn't have done it, just that it's really unlikely that he did.
Yeah, it's a funny thing. It's a smear that's thrown out to denigrate anyone who raises questions about the authorship, and sort of make people afraid of raising the question, because of course no one wants to be attacked as a snob, but it's an ad hominem attack. It's attacking the person rather than addressing the evidence or the arguments, and I think that's quite telling. But it's really a silly argument. Walt Whitman, the poet of democracy, doubted the authorship. So it's really not about class, and it's not about snobbery. It's about the evidence. And you raised the example of Christopher Marlowe is a very good one. He came from a very similar background as Shakespeare, as you say, the son of a cobbler. But you can trace the evolution of his intellectual development. He was educated at the prestigious King's School on scholarship, I believe, and then he won an additional scholarship to Cambridge. So you can understand how he evolved into the poet and playwright that he became. You can't trace that evolution with Shakespeare, so it's different. Ben Jonson's another example, the son of a bricklayer. and he went to the Westminster School, very prestigious school, and he thanked William Camden, the historian, for teaching me all that I know, he said. And then there's two places where he thanks Camden. So there you have again evidence of his education and of this fabulous tutor who mentored him. So it is about the evidence. It's not about, you know, a snobbery thing. It's people trying to understand how these works came about. And there's a wonderful quote from a psychologist who studies genius, Dean Keith Simonton. He's the world's expert on the psychology of genius. And he has said, you know, even geniuses don't possess such supposedly miraculous qualities as the scholars want to attribute to this Shakespeare guy, you know. And to him, it's really important actually to understand the biography and the truth about the author, because he says, you know, we will never really understand him until we understand the, you know, the factors, the life that contributed to this genius, you know, how it evolved. We have to understand that. So yeah, the snobbery thing is a silly argument, but it's amazing how people continue to throw it around. I think it's a little bit pathetic, really.
And a lot of the people flinging mud are Oxford professors and well-heeled middle-class gentry type folk themselves. So I always find that quite comical.
Yeah, it's a bit of projection in a way, perhaps. You know, it's the professors or elite figures saying, "Oh no, only we can speak with authority about Shakespeare." And often, if you raise the fact that some of the great Shakespeare actors, like Sir Mark Rylance or Sir Derek Jacobi, doubt the authorship, and these are people who have spent their whole careers immersed in the plays, they'll say, "Oh, they're just actors. They're just you don't know anything." Bit snobbish.
Well, exactly. I mean, Mark Rylance's Hamlet is one of the great Hamlets of all time, and Derek Jacobi, well, need we say any more? It's Sir Derek Jacobi. So, yeah, their opinions do count, and they are valid and very important ones.
Yeah.
Taking a slight pivot, before you wrote your book, as I understand it, you produced an article for The Atlantic. And I think that's on your Twitter page feed somewhere. I know I've read it. And I just wanted to, on the back of this discussion of psychology and heresy and reactions, can you explain for our listeners what happened in the wake of the article, which seems to be a very level-headed, simple argument in favor of Amelia Bassano or Mary Sidney? What happened?
The article ran 4 years ago, May 2019, in The Atlantic. It was titled, "Was Shakespeare a Woman?" I studied Shakespeare as an undergraduate and again in graduate school. I was very interested in the feminism of the plays and the female characters. The Cambridge scholar Juliet Dusenberry says Shakespeare's drama deserves the name feminist, for in his works, the struggle is for women to be human in a world that declares them only female. This is a kind of a recurring theme you find in a lot of commentary on Shakespeare. The scholar Anne Barton says Shakespeare's comedies show a sort of an uncanny understanding of and sympathy with women that's missing in the work of his fellow playwrights. How interesting. Orson Welles, the actor and director, said Shakespeare was clearly tremendously feminine. So, you know, I had sort of this question in the back of my head: how did this male 16th century playwright come to write feminist drama? And it's especially weird if you look at the biography of Shakespeare, because his own daughters appear to have been functionally illiterate. One signed with a mark, which is what you did if you couldn't sign your name, and another with a signature described by the director of the British Museum as painfully formed and probably the most she was capable of doing with a pen. That's very odd that the greatest writer in the English language wouldn't bother to educate his daughters. It's even odder when you look at the women in the plays, who are highly intelligent. You know, they write sonnets, they read Ovid, they compose letters. In The Tempest, Prospero is incredibly proud of the fact that he has educated Miranda. So it's a mismatch. It doesn't make sense. So okay, this is a long background to explain why I was interested in the possibility of a woman contributing in some way to the plays. You know, we know women have often had to conceal their work under male names or publish anonymously. And I had heard that there were male authorship candidates: Oxford, Marlowe, Bacon. But I was very surprised to discover reading around that some people had proposed female candidates. And I thought, oh, how interesting. No, I never hear about the female candidates. Let's do something on them. One is Mary Sidney, who was proposed in 1931 in a kind of group authorship theory, as you know, contributing to the female characters or helping to edit the plays. And then another is Amelia Bassano, proposed more recently to account for some of the Italian connections in the plays, and particularly a connection to the town of Bassano del Grappa, Italy, which seems to be sort of referenced in Othello. So that was sort of the idea behind the article. It was sort of edited to focus more on Amelia Bassano and the case for her, and it was fascinating to see the reactions to it. It was very, very polarizing. Some people loved it, other people hated it, and so I was sort of attacked for being a Shakespeare denier, and in line with people who question the historical evidence of the Holocaust or the scientific you know, validity of vaccines compared to anti-vaxxers and Obama birthers, and these really outrageous things. When, look, we're just talking about the attribution of 400-year-old plays here. People, calm down. What's going on? I was really shocked by that and really taken aback. It's very. I hadn't, you know, as a journalist, I was 29 when it came out. I hadn't had that experience before. It's really upsetting to be attacked that way in the public sphere, because frankly, you worry for your reputation and your career if you're being compared to these horrible figures that, no, you know, I don't want any comparison to. So I stepped back from the subject for a while, but I was really interested in this reaction, and I realized that the responses had actually given me something quite interesting, because, you know, why was a purely literary historical question about the attribution of some plays being raised into a moral problem? Because that's what those comparisons do. If you compare the authorship question to Holocaust denial or vaccine refusal, climate change denial is another one that gets raised. You're making it a moral problem, right? Question, because we recognize those issues as ethically problematic. So I realized that is what they are subtly doing by drawing that comparison. Why do they feel the need to do that? Why make it a moral problem to question the authorship? Why not just, no, we have the evidence for Shakespeare, you know, what is going on here with this extremely elevated, fairly hysterical language? And that, it was a kind of red flag to me, and that's what I wanted to investigate, how it became taboo, how doubting Shakespeare became a moral problem. And they're, you know, they've even said so explicitly. In 2011, Professor Stanley Wells, who's one of the great Shakespeare authorities in Britain, said it is immoral to question history and take credit away from William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon. Remarkable quote. Immoral to question history when inquiry is the very basis of the historical discipline and of all academic intellectual inquiry. So to me, that was what was fascinating. I thought, aha, this is what I need to investigate and write about. How, because it's a weird thing that in the modern 21st century university system, for a taboo like this to persist, it's something that should have died out, you know, in the 19th century or something, but it has persisted, and I wanted to understand why.
I mean, I'd assume as well, apart from fear on the part of your critics, there was also a good deal of kind of vested interest and stature and professional standing and reputational damage that could be inflicted by you kind of scoring hits. But of course, we can't prove that Shakespeare, the Stratford man, wasn't the author. We just propose that it's an improbable proposition. So it does make you wonder why there's so much paranoia in the halls of academia, because all those people are very established, and we could not, we dream of but could not take Sir Stanley Wells down. I mean, I think we probably dream of it, but you know, he's insurmountable. He's just written a book called What Shakespeare Was Really Like, and he can do that with a straight face. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very that's a funny book. That's funny that you mentioned it. But look at the reviews that have been written about that book. Emma Smith, a professor at Oxford, in her review, I think in the Telegraph, noted that Stanley Wells you know, does a kind of sleight of hand with the facts. Okay, so that's a nice way of saying he's not entirely accurate in this book. And what else? There's a lot of sort of, it's clouded with supposition, The Guardian said. And the portrait he puts on the cover is a portrait of Sir Thomas Overbury, not of Shakespeare. So people who know that book is not a very good book, but the general public eats up those books of Shakespeare because you know, they love those sort of fictional fun biographies. But back to the issue of vested interests. There is a lot of ego at play. I think that is true. And you find that, I would say, in all camps regarding the authorship question. And it comes down to the fact that people don't like to think that they might be wrong. You know, whether you believe it's Oxford or Marlowe or Bacon or Shakespeare of Stratford, no one wants to say, oh, maybe I'm wrong. So what happens is people defend their candidate and their belief to the hilt and get really emotional about it and look for evidence to support their belief. And that becomes, you know, it creates a kind of confirmation bias where maybe they're not looking at the evidence that conflicts with their belief, and they're searching out arguments to prove that they were right. And you know, it's just a human dynamic. You see this at any dinner table fight you get into with a relative about religion or politics or policy. You know, people want to be right, and they will look for things to prove that they are right. It's a human, very human flaw in the way that we operate. But it is really interesting to see how it comes into play here. And you know, the more people try to defend their initial belief, the more they get dug in and the more emotional they get about it. And then when you get to these professors, you know, they've written whole books, whole biographies on Shakespeare. Their whole reputations are staked on their theory of the authorship. So, you know, it's very difficult for them to now say, oh, well, okay, that might not be the case. Maybe it was, you know, it's very awkward. But it is interesting that you will find some professors acknowledging that. When I spoke to Stephen Greenblatt, you know, famous Harvard professor who wrote a very famous biography of Shakespeare, I was surprised that he acknowledged, well, he said sort of about all things, you know, to do with attribution, he said there's always some room for doubt. And he wanted to know more about the other theories. One thing that's interesting is that often you find these Shakespeare scholars, they actually haven't read the theories for the other candidates just because they assume that they're right and there's no question. So they don't even know kind of what they're arguing against. It's a funny situation. But and then there are other, you know, another professor contacted me after I wrote the Atlantic article, and he said, yes, of course, Shakespeare could have been a pen name or a scam or a committee of Bacon, Marlowe, Oxford. But to him, it didn't really matter. It's the plays that matter, study the plays. And that's actually the thing with the vast majority of Shakespeare scholars are not biographers. They don't write about the biography. They're literary critics, and they analyze the plays. And they're not thinking about who wrote them. That's not, they don't really see that as their role. Some of them are just not interested in that. Marjorie Garber, another professor I interview in the book, you know, she just said, I'm not interested in the biography. I'm interested in the plays. I'm interested in the characters. I'm interested in performances of the plays and interpretations of the plays. But she just sort of put up blinders. She wasn't going to go there. And I was a little what's the word? I found that odd because she's devoted her entire career to the study of these works, which she clearly admires so much. How can you not have a little bit of curiosity about where they came from and the life of the person and their experiences that shaped these works? It seems to me a bit disingenuous to just sort of to put up that kind of wall, you know. And so I said to her, look, you care so much about the interpretation of the plays. If it came out that they were by someone else, wouldn't that affect your interpretation? And she sort of said, well, you know, I rethink my interpretation of the plays all the time. And she said, I don't think of them as coming from a person. I think of them as a text. And I sort of pushed back, well, look, you know, text doesn't appear out of thin air. So we had this exchange, which I think that's actually the final chapter of the book. I hope readers will find it interesting. But it's a weird situation where some professors just won't go there. They don't want to talk about the authorship. It's the plays that matter. But it's kind of tell, I think, that there is something a little off with the biography. You know, otherwise they wouldn't have to do that. And even the professors who really defend the traditional narrative, they will often sort of end their argument by saying, oh, who cares about Shakespeare? We have the works. let's leave him off stage. I got a few reviews to that effect. And it's sort of the last line of defense for these scholars. They just sort of go, oh, who cares? Well, you're a scholar of the subject. It is your job to care. Other people don't have to care, but it is your job to care. So I think that it's a kind of giveaway that they know they know that the traditional narrative is pretty weak, and so all they do at that point is try to brush it aside.
Try to almost mitigate the damage by saying it doesn't really matter. Okay, so we are running very low on time, so I will apologise. I'm going to have to start to bring us to an end there. I'm going to put in my own praise for the book. The full title is Shakespeare Was a Woman and Other Heresies. Is by Elizabeth Winkler, who is on screen now, and I'd listened to the fantastic audiobook version narrated by Eunice Wong. My only complaint was her pronunciation of the word Derby, but I'll live with it. But it's a very, very good version as well if you don't manage to sit down and pick up a book very often. Elizabeth, feel free to plug anything else you are doing or any social media channels that you would like to, if you have anything along those lines.
Oh, I'm not plugging anything right now. I'm delighted to have talked with you. Thank you for your questions, and I hope people enjoy the book and buy it for your friends for Christmas.
Yeah, please do. We've ordered several copies for our school library, and they are actually in constant demand.
They are, yes. I've for my AQ community are armed with copies of the Winkler. You have become the Winkler, so they are armed with copies of
the Winkler. Oh my gosh.
The Winkler, yes.
Yes, you
are much for talking.
It's a pleasure. This Joe won't like this because it could be a long-winded reply, but I just wanted to get your opinion on Alexander Waugh and the Oxford argument, because I've had quite a few interactions with Baconians on Twitter, and they keep accusing me of privileging De Vere, and I got the impression that when you met Alexander Waugh, this could be a wrong impression, a takeaway from the book, but that he was maybe more convincing than Rosbarber or Marlowe, more convincing than the Bacon theory. So could we pin you to De Vere, or are you just too...
I shall not be pinned, I'm afraid.
Right answer.
Look, of course there's this rush to want to put like a different candidate in the empty throne, right? You've unseated the incumbent. Who's the real author? I specifically did not want to argue for any candidate in the book. I felt like my position was a journalist reporting on the controversy. I've reported on the different theories through my interviews with their advocates. And I really wanted to leave it to the reader to make up their own mind about the subject, because part of the fun of this whole thing is how it kind of messes with your mind, and how we construct the past through our own narratives and our own subjective lens and biases. So I wanted the reader to grapple with the problem and struggle with the questions and the inconsistencies without me telling them what to think.
Personally, I think, yeah, you did a fantastic job of it. I thoroughly enjoyed. I'm enjoying the book, and I know Christian has loved it so much that he's passed on a copy to everyone he knows, has ever known, ever will know, and has copies waiting for anyone he happens to meet in the street to hand to them.
Yep, absolutely.
I love to hear that. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate your time. We know you're busy, and it's wonderful to have you on. Thank you so much.
Yep.
It's been a pleasure.
And good luck with your next project.
Thank you.
Whatever that may be. Anon and farewell.
Thank you.
Oh, you haven't got your bell, have you, Christian? You can't ring the bell to end the episode.
I'm afraid I don't have a bell on this occasion, but we can dub one in later.
We'll dub one in later. Thank you, Elizabeth. Have a great rest of your day.